Good afternoon and welcome to our second lecture, this year's Jack P. Lewis lectures. Pleased to have Professor Randy Chesnutt with us. Gave a wonderful talk earlier on the pseudepigrapha and counseled us on using the pseudepigrapha in our New Testament study especially. And this afternoon we're pleased to have him again for the second lecture. And he will be demonstrating some technology, and you should move to this side because the screen is clearer on this side rather than this screen. So concentrate over here, and hopefully the technology, our technology, will work and jive well with his throughout the presentation. His lecture this afternoon is Old Testament text, not Old Testament text. That was this morning, earlier. Old Texts and New Technology, Recovering a 3rd Century Manuscript of Romans 4 and 5. So we're pleased to have with us Dr. Randy Chesnutt.
Well, when I get back home, and people ask me how things went, I'm gonna have to tell them that people in Alabama are left of center. This is coming from California and saying that people in Alabama are left of center, but from my vantage point, you're right of center, so I guess that's okay. Well, I talked earlier in my earlier presentation about a broad area of study that spans my whole academic career. And for this final session, unrelated to that, I want to turn to one manuscript fragment, the study of which I came to sort of through the back door and have been involved in just for a few years, but I want to talk about that. And I'm talking about a late 3rd century parchment fragment from Egypt that is pictured on the screen that preserves a copy of part of Romans 4 and 5, shown here recto and verso, or obverse and reverse, or if you don't mind, I think I'm just going to use the terms front and back. It was found in Fushtat in Egypt, near Old Cairo, and acquired there in 1950 by Boston University anthropologist Leland Wyman, who is pictured here, and hence it is often called the Wyman fragment, although the official designation for it is manuscript 0220 in the official registry of New Testament manuscripts in Münster, Germany, where these things are kept. Now, as you can see, there's a large gap in this manuscript. By the way, these are two sides of the same manuscript. This is not two fragments, it's the two sides of the same manuscript. And you can see that on this side, well, on both sides, of course, there's a large gap called a lacuna. But the text that does survive is in this one very legible, very, very clear, and in this one is not. And I will talk about the reasons for that in a minute. And I'm sorry that we don't have a little bit higher resolution closer up for you to see, because this is very legible Greek if you can read the majuscule script of Greek, and this one here is more blurry. And in fact, when the manuscript was found, or bought, at least in Egypt in 1950, the Leland Wyman came back to this country and he put it in the hands of a leading New Testament Greek and manuscript expert, William H.P. Hatch, who studied it and reconstructed the text on this side fairly easily and did it quite well. And his reconstruction of the text is shown here. Now, this is the reconstruction of his text on this one side. He didn't attempt to reconstruct the other side. And again, I'm sorry that you can't see it better, but the standard practice is followed here of bracketed parts, such as here, mean that the text is no longer visible. That's what's in this gap here. Letters with a dot underneath, again according to convention, means that the letter is partly visible, but not entirely visible. So there's an educated guess, usually a strong probability of what the letter is. So again, brackets mean it's completely reconstructed. A dot underneath the letter, which you can barely see in some of those letters, means that it's partially visible. Anyway, he reconstructed here the recto, or front side of this parchment manuscript, and did a good job and published it in the 1952 Harvard Theological Review. And his paleographic and his understanding of the paleography and the textual affinities of this work still stand today. He did do an excellent job. He dated the fragment to the late 3rd century, making it, quote, the earliest known witness to the text of Romans 4:23 through 5:13, a distinction that, as far as I know, still stands. It is also the earliest known copy of any part of the New Testament on parchment or animal skin rather than papyrus. I think it still holds that distinction. But that's the front side of the manuscript. Again, quite visible, and he did a good job reconstructing it. The other side, though, is not legible, much more degraded, exceedingly difficult to distinguish the letters on this side of the manuscript from the ink that has either bled through or is visible through the parchment from the other side. On this side, Hatch could only make out 3 or 4 words and was not even sure about those. And what I want to demonstrate to you today is our ability now to read this side of the manuscript and at last publish it. Not completely, but decipher most of what is on there. Hatch, in 1952, when he did his work, had only 2 tools at his disposal. An ultraviolet light, which he said was no help at all, and a magnifying glass. In comparison to the embarrassment of riches that we have today by way of technology to read this manuscript, even the photos that you're looking at there are infinitely better than anything he had access to a half-century ago. And I'll say more about how those photos were done in a minute. Soon after Wyman's death in 1988, the fragment was purchased and became part of the famous Skoyen collection in Oslo, Norway. And then in 2012, it was purchased for the Green Collection, now the Museum of the Bible Collection, and was assigned to me and to a colleague of mine at Pepperdine University, Ron Cox, to study and publish it in one of their forthcoming volumes, presenting the many artifacts of their collection. We're talking about the Museum of the Bible that's supposed to open in Washington, D.C., and is on schedule to open in November of this year. This is the Hobby Lobby, people. I think I saw a Hobby Lobby here in town, didn't I? This used to be more of a Midwestern thing, but it's all over now. There are a few in Southern California, for example, and some here now. And a few years ago, fairly few years ago, this family, the Green family, became interested in collecting antiquities, and they have very deep pockets, and it was a buyer's market because antiquities are available for legitimate antiquities, for purchase around the world today in libraries and universities. They're short of funds, so they have amassed an incredible collection in just a decade of time, and that will be on display in the Museum of the Bible in just a few months. And anyway, soon after they came into possession of this manuscript, the Green Collection, now the Museum of the Bible initiative, they invited me and my colleague to study and publish it. Now, soon after we began our work on it, we discovered something that was not known to the owners of the manuscript, and that is that not only this side was published in 1950, which they knew about, but this side had also been published. In 2005, when it was in the Oslo collection, the Skoyen collection in Oslo, an Italian scholar named Donatella Limongi published this side as well. And I show you now a picture of her reconstruction of that side. Again, you can't see that very well. And we were crestfallen, I suppose out of self-centeredness, to realize that we would not be the first ones to publish this side of the manuscript. But we soon realized that our work was needed anyway, because her reconstruction is riddled with mistakes, and there are a number of letters that she has a dot underneath, meaning that it's partially visible, where none is visible. It shouldn't have had a dot there at all. It should have been bracketed. And some of the things that she gave as a sure reconstruction, a visible letter, should have had a dot underneath. There were all kinds of problems with it. So we needed our work to be done in spite of the fact that it had been published before. And what I want to illustrate to you, and actually more importantly than any mistakes that she made, was the fact that we can, with technology available today, just discern far more lettering than she was able to do in that distant era in the past, 2005, because the technology has advanced so dramatically. So I want to return to and spend most of my time on the how of this process of reconstructing this manuscript, but let me say just a word first about the why. Why is an old fragment like this important, and a very small one at that? What's the big deal? Well, a couple of things. One is, for historians of Christianity, any bit of primary source data, however small, is significant. Even this manuscript, as small as it is, tells us something about a Christian community in the late 3rd century that preserved it. It tells us something about the social status of that community, about its contacts with other Christian communities, about its contacts with the larger world in terms of the mechanisms for literary production that it represents, and what it valued, its view of Scripture, and so on. But for those whose primary interest is the New Testament, the value of this manuscript lies in the fact that it is useful for reconstructing the text of the New Testament, or this one small portion of the text of the New Testament. Now, I say reconstructing because, as you know, we no longer have the originals, the autograph of this or any of the New Testament writings. They have long since disappeared. What we have is copies, handwritten until the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. And I said we have copies. Actually, a better way of saying it is we have copies of copies, or even more accurately, copies of copies of copies of copies, etc. And those copies vary widely in date and quality, and they are filled with mistakes. No two of them are exactly alike, except maybe a few small fragments. No two of them preserve exactly the same wording. And so the text of the New Testament that we read today, whether in Greek or in translation, has been reconstructed. It is a reconstruction of the earliest form of the text that we can get based on the close comparison and analysis of the available manuscripts, these many copies. Now, that is not to say that the text we have to say is not a reliable text of what Paul actually wrote, or Matthew actually wrote, or James actually wrote. Quite the contrary. We have many manuscripts, now numbering in the thousands, not to mention early versions in Latin and Syriac and other languages, early quotations from the New Testament by patristic writers, early church leaders. If we didn't have any manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, we could reconstruct almost all of it based on the quotations from it, from the various early writers who used it. We have not only that, but we have early church lectionaries, church service books that quoted the New Testament extensively, and other things. So we have a reliable text of the New Testament. Let there be no doubt about that. There are, to be sure, some lingering uncertainties, mostly on fairly inconsequential points of wording or spelling, and we'll talk about an example of that in a few minutes. And there are a few more significant ones, but for the most part, we have a reliable text of the New Testament that approximates the original writings. But the reason that we can confidently have that is that scholars have, experts have, over many centuries now, painstakingly pored over existing manuscripts to reproduce from them as accurately as we can the earliest form of the text that circulated. And so it's important when any new material comes to light, especially a very early manuscript, to assess its value for the textual tradition. Given our many witnesses to the text that we have, it's not likely at all that a newly discovered manuscript will introduce us to a radically new reading previously unknown in other manuscripts. That's possible, but highly unlikely. But what it will do is add its weight to one side or the other when there's a variant reading between or among the existing manuscripts, where we may not be sure what the original was worded like. So the process of New Testament textual criticism is an ongoing one, and our study of this manuscript is just one very small part of this ongoing enterprise. So that's a quick introduction to the why, maybe unnecessary, but the why of our study and the what of our study. But I want to turn now and spend most of my time on the how. How have we gone about trying to read the other side of the manuscript? To go back to that, to read this side of the manuscript that was not previously legible. Let me quickly show you one type of thing we did with rather old technology before we were able to, after we got the manuscript photographs, but before we studied the manuscript itself and got the technology that I'll demonstrate in a moment. We just had a few weeks interval there, and we started playing around with what we already had on our computers to see what we could do. And so one of the first things we did was just to put it in Photoshop and see if we could see some things there by way of reading that we were unable to do before. And let me illustrate that now by going to this part of the manuscript in a close-up of that. I'm sorry, that's the other side. That's the back side of the manuscript. But if you look at this carefully, right there, can you see that? There's a little flap that is actually backwards. It's turned, it's bent over from the other side. I hope you can see that right there. So what we thought we would try to do, and we managed fairly quickly to do it, is, let me show the other side of the manuscript. Now you can't see it here, but that little flap is actually behind what you're looking at right along there. And here's a close-up of that. The flap is right behind there. So what we would like to do is just reach in behind that and just pull out that little curl and flatten it out on the other side. Well, we can't do that with the manuscript itself, but we can do it digitally with Photoshop. And if you don't know what Photoshop is, not to worry, your kids and your grandkids know what it is. So you can tell you all about it. And in fact, we had students far better skilled in working with Photoshop than we were able to do. So we took that little photograph, flipped it, and put it back on the right side where it goes, and there it is. And we actually did that all the way around this looking a gap here. Some you couldn't do that with because they're curled, and you couldn't flatten it out digitally. But on that one, it's fairly flat. We could. Here's a major difference in working from parchment fragments as opposed to papyrus fragments. Papyrus fragments are very flat. You might have that piece turned the wrong way and on the other side, but it's flat and you can just move it right back into place. But parchment is animal skin. And skin, with age and passing of time, wrinkles. Trust me on that. It happens. And even after the animal is gone for a long time. So you see a lot of curls and furls and wrinkles here in the papyrus, in this parchment text that you wouldn't have in a papyrus manuscript. Now, that's just, again, old-fashioned technology that we were able to do a few things with. But then we got on our computers the technology that was developed at the University of Southern California. I don't like admitting that anything good comes from the University of Southern California, but it did in this case. Bruce Zuckerman, the director of West Semitic Studies research project at the University of Southern California, is a photographic expert in photographing antiquities. Those of you who know studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls know his work well, probably because he is responsible for bringing to light with his photographic techniques a number of portions of text from the Qumran scrolls that were not previously legible, and he's applied it to other things from antiquity, small objects, inscriptions, coins, and other small artifacts, as well as manuscripts. And as our neighbor in Southern California, he worked with us regularly, as well as with the Green Scholars Initiative, to make available for us some amazing images that make it possible at last to decipher the other side of this manuscript. Now, before I try to shift to that, and I never trust computer link up and all, but we'll see what happens in a minute. Let me just give a layman's explanation of how this technology works, and it'll have to be a very layperson's explanation because I don't understand it. I just know what it'll do for you, but I don't know how it works, but a layman's description would be this. What happens is it's called reflectance transformation imaging, RTI, reflectance transformation imaging. And what happens is you put a very high resolution camera over the manuscript, and then you take 36 different pictures of it with the camera in a fixed position, but the flash moves around to 36 different locations, all equidistant from the manuscript in a dome-shaped configuration around. And there's a little sensor that you put on the manuscript to sense exactly how far away that light source is and its exact angle. And then software is used to synthesize those into one picture that can then be examined with the software that I look at in a minute with an algorithm developed by Hewlett-Packard Laboratories. What you're actually looking at there now is not one photograph, but is a mushing together of 36 photographs. And the software developed at the University of Southern California to read this is called Inscriptifact, and it enables one not only to zoom in or out, but also by moving the mouse across the image to view parts of the manuscript from different vantage points with an endless variety of lighting combinations and shadows cast by those lightings and so forth, to see a great deal more than could be seen before. Things invisible just looking at it head on from one image. The best analogy that I can have for that, think of yourself as looking at a coin, an old coin, and you want to see the inscription on it and whatever is pictured there. And what do you do when you're looking at, let's say, a small coin? What you do is you move it around to get it in just the best light. And you get the shadows cast just the right way. And you may have to hold it close, or you may have to hold it far away. You can see things from one angle that you can't see if you hold it over here. And you just have to try 1,000 different things before you can have that aha moment and see exactly what that little image is or what the lettering is. That's what this software enables you to do. To move the mouse around, change the lighting and the shadowing as if you're moving the object itself. And of course to magnify it and see things that were not previously visible. So now if I can make this work, I want to try to go and illustrate this, and I'll come back to that. So here is that manuscript, and well, my computer here looks a lot better than up there, but we'll do what we can. There is one side of the manuscript. This is the front side, or the recto, and let me blow that up a little bit. Let's see, and move it over. And now, again, what this software enables you to do, I'm going to move the mouse around, and that has the effect of, again, moving it around in your hand, the coin image that I used, to see it in different lighting. And so let me do that, and let's see, I'm going to go back to light. And you see what happens there? I'm not sure how much of that you can see. Let me go over here. You can see just by moving that around, you change the lighting and the shadowing, and you can see things that you would not otherwise be able to see. You can see the crevices and rolls and pearls and furrows in the manuscript, and there is just an endless variety of combinations. You can use one light. You can use two lights. You can change the intensity of one of those lights or both of those lights and view it from just an endless variety of different possibilities until you can see that letter that you couldn't see in any way before. You can, let's see, what I had it on, excuse me, let me go to specular. Now that may not look like much, but what that enables you to do is to see the crevices and cracks, cracks and imperfections in the manuscript. You can't see the lettering there, but you can get a feel for the depth of these indentions, how much ink may be invisible because they're down in one of these crevices, which of course are tiny, but blown up here they look bigger. You can also, again, move the lighting around and just tell a whole lot about. So, for example, if in one of the other pictures you have a letter that is right here, then you can look at it in this picture and see that it is down in a crack, and so you expect it to be misshapen in the form that you're looking at, and so on. You can also go to one that is called diffuse gain, and that looks similar to what you saw a minute ago, except that this one is the one where, moving the light around again quite a bit, you can see the texture of the manuscript. You can see which side is the flesh side and which side is the hair side of this animal skin, and so on. You can learn a lot that way. And I'm not going to go to the other effects, but let me just say, or the lighting options rather, but let me just say you can use a local light. You can use a spotlight where, see, or if I want to blow that up, let me zoom in a little bit more. And again, use the spotlight. I think I left spotlight. There it is. And with all of these hundreds of possibilities, you can just, you may not find the information you're looking for in any other one, but you just eventually finally hit on the right one where you can see what you're looking for and read text that was previously illegible. Now this side of the manuscript was quite legible anyway, But let me go now to the other side. And here is where we may not have high resolution enough on this particular screen to see it. But this is the more illegible side of the manuscript. I'm going to blow it up a little. I believe that's enough. And move that over. And I'm sorry you can't see it, but maybe we can a little bit. Right here, for example, there are two letters, but it's problematic to read them because you're looking at the ink that is bled through from the other side, or that is visible through from the other side, as well as the ink that is on this side. So that looks like the letter He right there, an X is the way it looks. And that looks like the letter Rho right there looks like a P in the English language. That's what it looks like, but it's not, because that upright part of that P right there is from the other side of the manuscript. And part of this letter is from the other side of the manuscript. And again, if we had higher resolution, you could see this. But what you're looking at there, right up here, again, is not a Rho at all. It's the letter sigma, an S. Looks like a C, a lunar sigma, a C-shaped letter. And again, if we have a high resolution, you could see that because it's perfectly C-shaped. Maybe I can't hold that still enough to illustrate. Maybe I can here. Right here, can you see that? That's a perfect C shape. And what you have there is the letter He and the letter sigma with a little bar over it. Can you see that bar above those two letters? And what you have then is the first and last letters of the name Christ. This was a typical way of abbreviating it. The first letter and the last letter and the superlinear bar indicate that. And we can see that now rather clearly. I know you can't in that picture, but if you want to look at my computer here later, you can. And thanks to the green people. And by the way, buy things at Hobby Lobby, because if you buy things at Hobby Lobby, then they buy things from me at Hobby Lobby. Toys that study manuscripts with it, so that's kind of nice. I say manuscripts plural. This is the only one that I've worked on, although they say that when we've completed this one, there's some other things to do. Right here, and this maybe is one you can see a little bit, there is what looks like a Y right there. That's the letter upsilon in capital unsealed Greek letters. And that one you can see rather clearly, and what you can't tell here, but again, if you want to look at my computer, you can see it. The ink on this side of the manuscript that you're looking at is very splotchy. When you see ink that looks more solid, fainter but more solid than that, that is ink that you're seeing from the other side. And so with this technology, we're able to distinguish between the ink on one side and the ink on the other side. And so that's how this material helps us. And long story short, we can come back to that. And again, if you'd like to look at it up close later, you're welcome to do that. But let me go back to PowerPoint for a minute and well, before I get to what I thought I was doing next, here we are in Oklahoma City where this manuscript was in a warehouse working on it. You notice that we're wearing sweaters because it's very cold in that room. They keep it that way to protect their artifacts. Right back here is some photographic equipment. I don't even want to think about how many hundreds of thousands of dollars that photographic equipment is worth. It's not the RTI stuff that I was just talking about. It's a different kind of photographic technology where there's a light underneath that shines up through a piece of parchment, and then lights from the top as well, and does some photographic work with a very expensive camera that enables you to see some things that we were not able to see before. So these are converging bits of tools that we have to learn some things one way and another through a different bit of technology. And we did all this high-powered stuff, and then in addition to that, what we're using right there in that picture, I'm using a little tool that costs $2.88 and buying on Amazon today for $2.88. It's a magnifying glass that has a little high-powered little bulb of some kind, and you can get right down on top of the manuscript and just see some things that we could not see with technology that costs, I don't know how many tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here we are back on the campus at Pepperdine doing it on a very high resolution monitor, setting it on our computer but projecting it up there. One of us in this picture here actually has the required latex gloves on. I don't know why my colleague does not in that picture. He's supposed to. Although the manuscript is between little pieces of glass, and I don't have to worry that we're going to do any damage to it. There it is right there. And I know, I'd say that, I know it looks small. I know you may have been expecting to see some big manuscript. It's just a little, in fact, here it is life size. Here's the front and back side of that. It's tiny. My wife was disappointed that I had done all this work, and then I showed it to her. Well, it's not very big. But what I was about to get to is this. As an example of what we have been able to read that could not be read before. In particular, I'll refer to that line right there. The second line on the verso, or the back side of this manuscript. It has 31 letters, and whether or not you can see it there are 19 of those letters that have a dot underneath. Lemontier, when she reconstructed this text in 2005, was able to discern the whole text except 19 of the letters had a dot under it. And we have been able to reduce that number from 19 to 9, just on that one line. Or stated positively, she could read with near certainty 13 of the 31 letters on that line. We can now read with either certainty or near certainty 23 of the 32 letters on that line. And I'm not sure how much, there's a close-up of that line. I'm not sure how much this is going to show, but maybe you can see it here. Look right here, for example. Yeah, this is actually more visible. Right there, that ink in that little V-shaped, upside-down V-shaped configuration, right here, is bleeding through from the other side, or visible from the other side. But this ink, right here, see that Y-shaped thing there? Can you see that? That is ink on this side of the manuscript. That's an upsilon, looks like the letter Y, that's on this side of the manuscript. And that just was not visible just a few years ago, but now we can do that. So what you're seeing now is actually just a mini version of what we can see on all of the lines in the manuscript. Let me, so we have written that in. So look at this one. It looks like the letter Y, and I'm going to toggle back and forth. Once that's written in there, can you see it? Or look at this one way over here. Looks like little letter C. That's the sigma, the lunar sigma. And I'm going to toggle in and out on that. Look at that one. And now, oops, went the wrong way. So you see that C there now, or sigma it actually is. And once I make it disappear, you can see it. So we've just been able to distinguish what could not be done before, the lettering on one side from the lettering of the other. And here it is up here. Those are the four letters: the sigma, a noon or N sound, the upsilon or looks like a Y, and another noon. Very visible here that simply were not visible and had to have dots under them. Again, in that long ago age of 2005, but we can now read. So let me note a few things, a few other kinds of things about the manuscript, and then we can come back to that as time permits. In terms of size, I've already told you that the manuscript is not that big. There's the size of it in centimeters, and I should translate that into inches. I don't know how big a centimeter is. I mean, I do intellectually, but I should write this out in inches. I'm in Alabama now, and I grew up in Alabama, so I should use inches instead of centimeters. But as a in deference to scholarship, I still use centimeters sometimes, though I don't like it, and I don't think in those terms. But it's not very big. Anyway, there are the dimensions of it. 31 or 32 letters per line, and about 12 to 14 lines on each side of the page. Brown ink, and specialists in the paleography of this material. Paleography is just the study of the script or writing style, handwriting style of the manuscript in antiquity. And expert paleographers, I'm not one, but expert paleographers can, by looking at the handwriting style, determine with pretty close proximity the date of an ancient text, because the shape of certain letters changed from one generation to another. Whether two letters were combined or written separately, distinctly, changed from one generation to another. And whether you have a little ligature or curlicue at the end of the letter, changed from one time period to another. And so looking at those converging lines of evidence, an expert paleographer can date a manuscript pretty closely. And again, I'm not a paleographer or a son of a paleographer, but we have worked with top flight paleographers. The best ones in the world are at Oxford in England, and our green sponsors, green family sponsors, have enabled us to go there and use the resources we need to date it. And they have confirmed what Hatch said a whole generation or two ago now, and that is that it dates to the late 3rd century. We have now, in an abundance of scholarly caution, allowed that it may be early 4th century rather than late 3rd. But anyway, late 3rd or early 4th century, it still makes it the oldest text of Romans 4 and 5 in existence anywhere. And that gives me a great sense of self-importance. There are slightly older or just as old fragments of other parts of Romans, but this still has the distinction of being the oldest one in existence. Now, again, I'm not a paleographer, but we can all see this even without knowing the Greek alphabet if you don't. And that is the difference between two different kinds of letters. And this is a very important point that I'll come back to later to make another point. Notice the difference between two groups of letters. One group of letters is small and rounded, like this omicron here, sigma here, a theta right there. Another theta is there. An epsilon is a small and rounded letter. There's another epsilon. There's a sigma. There's an omicron. Small, rounded letters, as opposed to large, broad, angular letters like kappa, the J sound here. Nu, the N sound here. There's another one. Upsilon, big letter. There's another kappa, very broad, big, angular letters. There's an eta, same thing. Nu. I said nu, I'm thinking Hebrew. Sorry. This is Greek. An eta there. Again, store that away. I'll come back to that. Large, angular letters as opposed to little, diminutive letters rounded. Omega, the last letter in the alphabet, is not angular, but it's very wide. There's one. There's one right there. Store that distinction away. It is many things like that, those little subtleties that enable expert paleographers to date this manuscript with confidence to the late 3rd, or now we're saying maybe the early 4th century. And by the way, we have confirmed that now, not we, because again, I don't understand the technology, but we have had carbon-14 dating done on this manuscript, and that also dates it to sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries inclusive. That's about as precise as it can be, but 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century. So it puts it in the same date range, although the paleographic dating is more precise. Now, in addition to the paleography, or the shaping of the letters, what you look for in a manuscript to date is the nomina sacra, that is the sacred names and how they're abbreviated, because that changed from one time period to another. And by the way, was unique to Christian manuscripts. You do not find this in manuscripts of classical Greek texts, or of Jewish texts for that matter. This is unique to Christian manuscripts, where, and I already illustrated this, you take the first letter and the last letter, and then you put a little bar above it to let the reader know there's been an abbreviation used. And we have it here, and we have here, and I'm going to write this in and darken it. And by the way, don't think that we did that darkening on the manuscript itself. I did this on the digital thing you're looking at, not on the manuscript. That's the letters K and N, basically. It's the word kurion, kurios, Lord, with a different ending on it because of its function in the sentence. And I'll tell you in a minute why I'm calling attention to this. First of all, because it's an important evidence in the dating of the manuscript, but there's another reason too that I'll get to. Some of the others said that's kurion. In the script you're probably more familiar with. Lord. The word there is Jesus Christ, and it is abbreviated the same way. 2 words, of course. The first letter of the word, the last letter of the word, and a bar above it, Jesus. And then Christ, first letter, last letter, and a bar above it. Standard way of doing that at this time period. Here's the word for God, the theta, and then upsilon. Of God it means. And same thing again, first letter, last letter, superlative bar. Now I go to the other side of the manuscript that is not as clear. We talked about this one already. There you can actually see it better than the image we looked at earlier. which should be actually a lot clearer than this. But there's the letter He, the first letter in the word Christ, and the lunar sigma, the rounded sigma. This upright bar there doesn't count because that's from the other side. And that is simply the word Christ. He and sigma, Christos, first letter, last letter, bar. Here is another occurrence of God, first letter, last letter, the lunar bar. And here is one, you saw it before, of Jesus Christ. And there's one that you can see. I've written those in, but let me go back now. And you see that lettering from the other side, and then, of course, clearer once I darken that in. That is Jesus Christ again, even on the less visible side of the manuscript. And not only are the sacred names abbreviated, but occasionally there are other words abbreviated. One of the ones that is done fairly frequently in New Testament manuscripts, I didn't know this until I started working on this manuscript, is the word man or men. Sometimes that gets abbreviated. I have a feeling because it is in the Gospels, as you know, Jesus is the Son of Man, and so it is a sacred name in that context. And so it gets abbreviated there, and then the word man gets abbreviated in other cases. Here's just the word man. This time they use the first two letters, and because it's an ending to indicate its function in a sentence, they use the last three letters. It's more than just two letters, first two and the last three, and this just means men. But has a particular case ending on it to indicate that function in the sentence. Now, I stress this last one because one of the things we need to do, if we can, is to fill in these gaps to see how much room is there, to count the available spaces there are for letters, and fill it in to see how that corresponds with the existing text we know from our printed Greek New Testaments today. And there's a place up here where, according to all of our manuscripts, the word man should appear. But there's not enough room for it. But there is enough room for it, since we know that that is one of the words that's abbreviated. So the word that should appear right up there is this long word. But what we do have room for is the first two letters and the last two letters of that word. So we can make an educated guess that that word did appear there, but in the abbreviated form. And why can we guess that that would be abbreviated? Because it is abbreviated in a part of the text that we do that. The only other abbreviation besides the sacred names and related words in this text is a very interesting one to me, and that is right at the end of this line right here, there's the letter kappa, K, and I know that doesn't look like a K to you now, but I'll prove to you a little bit later that it is, and I'm going to circle that, and then I'm going to write in the kappa so you can see it. And again, going back, I know you can't see the upright part of that kappa right there, as you can in my black overlay, but I'm going to show you another picture in a few minutes where you can see it. And then you see on the right-hand side of that letter kappa a little hook over here on the right side. Let me darken that in. And what that is just an abbreviation for the word and, A-N-D, and, kai in Greek. That is standard practice. The little kappa with the little hook on the right-hand side, pictured there as in some other manuscripts, is just an abbreviation for kai. Just as we might, if we're handwriting something, instead of writing out A-N-D, we do our little, what do you call that? That's not the ampersand, is it? It is ampersand. Anyway, we use our little abbreviation. The Greeks did that as well. And that's another indication of date because habits on that changed over with scribal hands over the different centuries. But an interesting thing to notice about that is that the word kai, and, appears elsewhere in the manuscript, written out fully. Here it is right there. See those three letters? Kappa, Alpha, Iota, Chi. Here it is too, right there. Kappa, Alpha, Iota. So why abbreviate it here? It's because it's at the end of a line. It's written out when it appears elsewhere, but when it's at the end of a line, it's abbreviated in that way in order to keep your right-hand column neat. It's a way of justifying the right margin, which we can do a little more easily with our computers today, but they had their way of doing it. And so, is that an unusual phenomenon, or am I just making up that explanation? Now, let me go to another manuscript from that time period. This is Manuscript Vaticanus, the Vatican manuscript of the New Testament, one of the oldest New Testament copies that we have. And if you look right there, I have it circled, you have the kappa again with a little hook on the right, letting you know that that's their abbreviation for chi, and yet, elsewhere in the manuscript, as here, for example, the word chi is written out. And there's another example of it. So again, it was standard in the time to write it out when it was within the column of text, but if it's at the end, to abbreviate it in that way. Now, going back to our manuscript, what makes this even more unusual than that is that this is not the word chi at all. It is the letters kappa, alpha, iota within a larger word. It is the word dikaiothentis. This is Romans 5:1. Having been justified by faith. You know Romans 5:1? This is that word. And they're the first three letters of the word. And then here is the rest of it. Othentis over here. Containing the word on the next column. So this is not the word chi at all. It is just the letters kappa, alpha, iota within a larger word. Is that unusual? No, it's not. How do we know that? Well, let me take you now to Manuscript Sinaiticus, the oldest copy, the oldest complete copy of the New Testament in existence anywhere. It's in the British Library in London. We saw it again a couple weeks ago. And here we have, where I have it circled there, the little abbreviation for chi again, kappa, with the little book on the right-hand side, for the letters kappa, alpha, iota. But this is not the word and at all. It's the letters kappa, alpha, iota within a larger word, dikaiu, at the end of that line, and then the beginning of the next. Dikaiu, again in Romans 5. That one happens to appear in Romans 5, chapter 7. So that phenomenon of not only abbreviating the word chi, but the letters chi, when they come at the end of a line, within a larger word was standard at the time. There are some other things about the paleography of the text, the way they shape letters and so forth that we could talk about, but I believe I'll skip over that and go to the most significant textual variant in the work, in this text. There are a couple of others. I might mention that there's one variant in Romans 5:2 where it says, through whom we have obtained access to this grace. Some manuscripts read, through whom we have obtained access by faith to this grace. In the manuscripts, they're fairly equal, ancient manuscripts, they're fairly equally divided whether those words by faith occur there or not. Not a big deal. By faith occurs elsewhere in the passage, and probably it was not there in the original, and some scribes had just heard it so often that they inserted it into that place naturally. This manuscript does not have by faith in it, so it sides with those manuscripts that do not have it. Now, as it happens, that comment that I just made is about a part of the manuscript where there's the gap, and we don't know what it reads. But we know that there's not room for the two-word thing by faith in there. But if we leave that out, as many manuscripts do, we can reconstruct that line, and it has just the right number of letters and everything fits. So there are a couple of variants like that, but nothing of significance. The one that has the greatest significance is in Romans 5:1. And you don't have to know Greek to follow the argument here. Does that text say, echomen with this letter, omicron, as our O vowel, or echomen with this letter, omega, as our O vowel? Just one letter difference between those two words. And the difference is this. If it is spelled this way, it means, since we're justified by faith, we have peace. Indicative statement. But if it's spelled this way, it means, since we're justified by faith, let us have peace. An exhortation, a hortatory subjunctive is called. All based upon that one letter difference. This would have been pronounced alike in the ancient world. These two would have been virtually indistinguishable. So did the original read this, or did it read this? Well, the manuscripts are fairly evenly divided between those two. And scholars for a long time have debated which one is more likely to be original. It doesn't make a huge difference. I mean, it's not going to affect what you do on Sunday morning. I mean, it's just devastating for one's faith one way or another. That's not the point. But here's an example of a variant where the manuscripts that we have are fairly evenly divided. So how does our manuscript, you notice what I said, our manuscript as if it belongs to me. It doesn't. But, let me have a little flexibility here. Even though it does not belong to me. I wish it did. does this manuscript read on Romans 5:1? That would be an important thing to know because, as I said earlier, it is the oldest text of Romans 4 and 5 in existence. So how it reads on this contested reading wouldn't solve the issue of which one the original had, but it would tell us how the earliest existing text. And fortunately, this is on the good side of the manuscript. It's fairly legible and you can read it. Unfortunately, at exactly the place where the old vowel appears, there's a little hole. And the letter is not there. We have the letter before it, we have the letter right after it. We know it's Echelman, we just don't know whether it's Echelman with an omega or Echelman with an omega. And so, the question becomes, is that hole omicron sized or omega sized? And that we can't answer. Here is the text, and the disputed part is right there. You can't see the letter he, the second letter, but right there, that hole is where the O vowel appears. And then the men, the second part of the word, is at the beginning of the next line. So, the one letter that we would really like to have is missing because of that hole. So the question becomes, as I said, the question becomes, is this an omega-sized hole or an omicron-sized hole? And I was going to demonstrate to you with PowerPoint, with Photoshop rather, how we do that, and it's not very visible on this screen. If you want to look at it later, I'll show it to you on this. But what we can do is crop a given letter and then see if it will fit into that hole. So for example, I could crop that letter, there's an omega right there. I could crop that one and then move it over and see if it would fit in there. Or here's an omicron right here. There's another one. I could crop that. It's a good dark one. I could crop it and then just move it down and see if it would fit in. And long story short, the omega will not fit. And the omicron easily does. We had a student go through and crop every existing example on both sides of the manuscript of omicrons and omegas. And they vary in size a bit. But the omega is just always wider, and there's not a single one of them that would fit, whereas the omicron regularly does. So even though there's a hole there, we know that the omega would not fit, and the omicron does. So that means that this manuscript favors the reading, we have peace, the indicative, rather than the word for subjunctive, let us have peace. That doesn't, again, resolve the issue of which one was original, but it tells us what the earliest existing manuscript had at that point. And there I come back to the point that I was making earlier and emphasized, I told you to store this away. Think again of the little diminutive rounded letters like omicron, sigma, epsilon, even theta. Theta is a tiny little letter. In the script you probably learned, theta is a taller letter, bigger letter, but not in this manuscript. That's typical of this time period. And so the omicron is a small little letter and it will fit in that hole. The omega, look at that, broad, wide omega, there's another, it simply will not fit. You could make it fit, but then if you did, you wouldn't have enough room for the key, which is partially obliterated, that comes before it. So we think that without any questions, more than thinking, without any question, this manuscript favors the reading we have peace rather than let us have peace. Now, if some of you may be looking at your textual apparatus in the Greek New Testament, and what both the Nestle Aland text, 28th edition, now out in the new, and the new 5th edition of the United Bible Society's Greek text, they both print the Echelman reading with omicron, we have peace. And then they list the other reading in the manuscripts that support that. And let me go to that now. Well, there it is. Well, there's the whole thing. You could get omicron in the bottom right. Again, you can't see that very well. But if you look very carefully, you may be able to see it on the first. I'm going to look at it on my screen to find it, and then I can show you. Oh, it's down at the bottom. Oh, here it is. Right there it says 0220. That's the manuscript. So what it does is it gives the manuscripts that support the reading in the text with the omicron, lists the manuscripts that support those, and then it gives the other possible reading in the manuscripts that support that. And in support of the Echelman reading with omicron, it lists our manuscript 0220. And then that's what you can't see here. A little superscript letters VID. That means apparently. Apparently, 0220 supports everything that they put in the text. What we think we can do now with virtual certainty is eliminate that VID, and it supports that reading rather than apparently supporting that reading. We had a student working on this with us recently, and she said that her goal in life was to remove a vid from the New Testament, and we think we were able to do that. So I'm going to be, once we publish this, I'm going to be very surprised with the next edition in 29, and that's what I'll line the text, and the new 6th edition of the United Bible Society studies, whenever those come out, if they don't just list 0220 without an apparently qualification there. If they do, they shouldn't do otherwise. I mean, it's just clear now. Now, I've got time to just mention only a couple of other quick things about the ongoing aspects of our work, and then we'll stop and see what questions you might have. After working for a while with the RTI renderings, reflectance transformation images that I illustrated to you earlier, we requested and received support for some additional photographs that we thought we might learn more from, and we did. Remember that I told you that in the RTI renderings, the camera is in a fixed position. It's the lighting that you move around that enables you to move the mouse and see those different lighting patterns. So what we thought is we might see down into some of the little cracks and crevices better if the camera were moved to different angles. And so we requested and received funding for them to do, and again it's done at the University of Southern California, of all places, to, sorry, I'm an Alabama football fan. I just have any trouble with anything good coming out of this. But, so what they did is they took pictures at 15 degrees, and then 30 degrees, and then 45 degrees, and then 60 degrees, and 75 if I'm counting right, and then 90, and all the way over to 180 degrees. Shifted the whole thing 15 degrees, and did that all again. Twisted it 15 more degrees, did it again. It gave us just hundreds of renderings that enable us to see down into some of those cracks that we couldn't see when the camera was in a fixed position. Now, they have not yet developed the software. In fact, they don't plan to develop the software to read that and synthesize that data because there's some dispute among the specialists whether that's possible or whether that would require too much extrapolating from those pictures to give us the ability to do what we were doing in the static images a minute ago. But what I can show you is one example of how that helped us see some things that we couldn't see before. Here is one of those tilt images. I don't know how many degrees that is, probably 15. Remember I told you earlier that over here at the end of this line, that letter right there looks this way, and I told you that it is a kappa, but you couldn't see the upright part, and that I would come back to that. Well, here's the way it looks in this manuscript, where you, in this photograph, where you can see the upright part. So by looking at these images that have been done from different angles, we are again able to recover more and more data that we knew was there, we were pretty sure was there, but this becomes the clincher. So that has helped us a lot. And then there's one other thing for which we requested funding and didn't get. And let me tell you what that request was and what we thought we might learn from it, and then tell you where that stands now. We requested that we also have some funds for what's called multispectral imaging, or now it's more commonly called spectral imaging. And what that enables you to do is to see light reflections not visible to the naked eye. As I understand it, and some of you are way better scientists than I am, the human eye only has receptors to see red, green, and blue. But there's a much broader spectrum of light wavelengths, all the way from ultraviolet to infrared. And so there is photographic technology available that can discern those different wavelengths of light not available to the human eye and translate them into a color that we can see. So, for example, think about the maps, the weather maps that you've seen in the last few days, Harvey, or as the weather moves into your own area, where you'll see things on a weather map exist on the real map out there, but data does exist in their photographic images that they can represent with those colors. So doing that, we thought that we might be able to see some things about the text that were not visible to the naked eye, whether it be true impressions or ink that had been scraped away for them to change the lettering or other kinds of information. As it turns out, the Hobby Lobby people had put all of their money by that time into getting this museum opened, and they declined our request for funding to do that. They had no reason to complain about that. They had done almost everything else we asked for and were wonderfully supportive, and so couldn't do that. We thought that would help us in lots of ways, but especially we thought it might help us, and I'm going to back up now if I can to this image. We thought it might help us on the Eckermann thing right here at the end of this line, because if you see there's a little bit of discoloration around that hole. But what we can't tell from that discoloration is that the typical discoloration that appears around holes generally, or is it ink? We can't tell that with the RTI renderings, and we certainly can't tell it with the naked eye. But with multispectral imaging, we might be able to, because when covered with ultraviolet light or infrared light or something else between, the ink would give off one image, and the discoloration around the hole would give off a different image. What we think is that at the top of this hole, we think that discoloration right there is ink, and not just the physical discoloration around holes. But we need the multispectral imaging to bring that out. One light here is red and the other is blue. So we think that we can distinguish between those two things if we got these spectral images. But again, they decided not to fund that. And by the way, if that proves to be ink right at the top of that hole, then it has to be Omicron, not Omega, because the Omega is open at the top. There wouldn't be ink there. It would be rounded Omicron would have ink. So this would be the clincher for what we think is already the case. Anyway, long story short, in our end is they decided not to fund that, and we went on with our other work and decided to publish our work. And then knowing that a few years later someone would come along and do that spectral imaging and maybe refine our regular work, and that's fine, that's how scholarship progresses. We really wanted it done, but couldn't get it done. Then along in March, through no additional effort on our part, no request, no anything, they called us back and said, hey, we have your multispectral imaging funding now. In fact, it's already done. I mean, my colleague Ron Cox got the email about the same time I did, and he came down the hall to my office just to did you get that email? Can you believe it? So they have now done the spectral imaging. And I can tell you, this is the first time, I'm serious about this, this is the first time this has ever been announced publicly, right here at Heritage University. You're the first people to hear this, that the results of that multispectral imaging will be given to us next week. Literally 2 days ago, less than 2 days ago. I was to fly here on Wednesday, which I did. On Tuesday night, we got an email that said, okay, it's all done now, you already need it. We're ready to give it to you as soon as you can get with us. In fact, they sent us stuff electronically. It's right here on this computer. But I don't know how to do it yet and what to make of it. So we're getting with them in a few days to find out the results of that test. We think what it's going to have, what it's going to reveal, is that it is to clinch what we already know. That this is an Omicron, not Omega. But we would like to have that clinching bit of evidence. And who knows what else the spectral imaging might be. But our ongoing work is to work primarily with the RTI renderings and just to whatever extent we can with the multispectral imaging and other technologies available to complete our reconstruction of this text and then to publish it. And we hope that that will be finalized in about a year or so. These things take time and we do have day jobs. So that's where we stand. And I'm going to leave it at that. I could talk again on and on about this, but maybe you have a question or a comment or observation about this, and I'll make a stab at trying to address it.
The New American Standard has both renderings. It has
What does it give in the
Let us have it.
Let us have in the column, but we have in the main part of the text. That is now I wouldn't say consensus view. The evidence is too evenly divided for there to be a strong preference one way or the other. But both Greek New Testaments of the two that are in most common use do it that way, and that is, scholars are leaning that way. And with this evidence, they will lean that way even more, if it turns out that way. A few days ago, I would have said we're sure about, but now that we have one more test coming, and I think it will be definitive, we'll be even more sure about it. Other things? Yeah.
So with the date that you have for it, it's before Constantine made Christianity legal. Is this type of is that one of the reasons why this type of material for a manuscript is unique? I don't really know what. Or would it be harder to get access?
You mean the parchment rather than papyrus? I don't know. I don't think we have any way of doing it. It is just very unusual for whatever reason at this early stage to have something on parchment. There's just two examples. Only three that I know of that even come close to being sort of that. But I don't know any. Somebody else, yeah.
Is that the reason possibly why they used abbreviations? Was in case someone got a hold of it, they might not know that they're talking about Christ or
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. Again, it's easy to say what is done. It's a little harder to say why it was done. And I doubt that was a big deal because there's no other obvious effort in these texts to hide the name of God or Christ or anything. I mean, these are Christian texts. Everybody knows that. There wouldn't be any doubt about that when you pick it up. So I doubt they're trying to obscure the name for that reason. I think that it's more likely that this is just an easy way. Writing materials are expensive. The more space you took up, the more expenses involved. So if you can abbreviate some things, everybody knows what you mean when you talk about Jesus Christ. And so if you can abbreviate it, do it. We do it in our own handwriting, right? As I mentioned earlier, we did that with the word man. I have a feeling that's the way they did it. But it is unique to Christian manuscripts. You do not find that in classical Greek or Hellenistic Greek texts. And you find it there in Christian text only with selected words. So for whatever reason, this is a uniquely Christian phenomenon.
So publication, what's the publication would be?
It is in, I forget the exact name, but it's the Green family and the people related to the Museum of the Bible have a series of publications coming forth from Brill in the Netherlands, which those of you who work in academia will know that that's the most expensive publisher in the world, so you won't be able to afford it, I believe. It would cost several $100s, but they are publishing their archives one volume at a time. They have one volume that is coming out just almost any day. And then ours is supposed to be in the second volume of that, and then others to follow. But the holdings in the Museum of the Bible are so extensive that I've heard figures, and this may not be exactly right, but it's in the ballpark. If they continued at the current pace of having scholars examine and publish their materials that they are going to have on display starting in November, it would take something like 200 years for it all to be examined and published. We're talking about tens of thousands of books. You shouldn't say that because you can see everything you can. They will have already come under a lot of fire because they're evangelicals, they're conservative people. And of course, the politically correct climate out there right now is that evangelicals, Bible-believing people, can't be objective, and so you can't trust the scholarship there. We, the more progressives and liberals, of course, can't be objective. Well, I, for one, question that premise, but that's the premise that's out there, and so it will get some negative press, and already has. But these are not wildly fundamentalist people who just, feel like that they have found Noah's Ark and therefore prove Genesis to be correct and that sort of thing. They are conservative, borderline fundamentalist, evangelical people, but they are not of that stripe. And so I think a lot of criticism has done there. But you will hear that when the museum goes online. But it's going to be well worth seeing. I've seen some of their smaller exhibits in 2 or 3 places, and just absolutely outstanding. They have the second largest collection of Torah scrolls from the medieval period in the world. Second largest in the world. They have the second largest collection of Dead Sea Scrolls fragments outside Jerusalem. I mean, the largest one outside Jerusalem, second largest in the world, etc. They have a little prayer book from 16th century that is signed by Henry VIII himself in his own hand. They have the original, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and they have Elvis's Bible. But they have a wonderful collection of English Bibles, Torah scrolls, and New Testament manuscripts, Old Testament manuscripts, something like 10 or 11,000 cuneiform clay tablets previously unpublished. Mummy masks that were made from paper mache, which when disassembled have texts made of discarded papyrus fragments that or whole sheets of papyrus when disassembled will give us manuscripts of Aristotle and who knows what all that New Testament manuscripts and everything. There are 400 of those, about 5 or 6 of which have been water soaked and disassembled more specialists do that. And so it'll be a great museum when it comes out. Yes.
As far as the techniques you've shown us today, that's been really interesting. Do you know if some of those techniques, like this spectral image that you guys took with the lights, or spectral imaging, that kind of thing, is that being used on more difficult fragments, or is that something that you pioneered in doing this?
Yes, and yes, the first part of what we got to know that the reflectance transformation imaging, as far as I know, has not been that widely disseminated. But the multispectral imaging has. In fact, that was developed first of all for space technology and was used for imaging in space and has then much later been applied to biblical manuscripts and other things. And yes, it has been extremely valuable in all kinds of things. For example, as you know, in the ancient world, writing materials were expensive, and so you would take a manuscript that had previously been used, and if you didn't want that text any longer, rather than discarding it, you would erase all that writing and then write your new text on top of it. Well, sometimes what they erased was a New Testament manuscript. And I care a lot more about that than whatever writing they put on top of it. Multispectral imaging can filter out that top layer of writing and give you a perfect text at the underneath writing. So that has been done not only with biblical manuscripts, but in other things they have found. For example, some musical pieces from the Baroque period that were the underneath writing on such manuscripts. They have recovered those. Found some poems of William Faulkner that no one knew existed because it was faded away. They have found a text that goes way back into antiquity of Archimedes that is preserved that way. Beautifully printed text with spectral imaging that was scarcely visible, if at all. And on other things, I've been applied to a number of other things. I understand, and I don't know this firsthand, but I understand that the original draft of the Declaration of Independence has a few words that Thomas Jefferson himself scratched out and replaced with a different word. And you can't see that with the naked eye. With spectral imaging, you can see not only the top layer, the finished product, but you can see what he erased and put another word over it. And maybe the best example is, you know, the 19th century explorer, David Livingstone, African explorer. When he was traveling in Africa back during the Victorian period, he ran out of paper to write his journals on, and so he started writing it on newspaper, on top of newsprint. And he ran out of ink, so he just found berries out in the wild in Africa and made little primitive ink out of that and wrote it on top of newspaper. Well, that stuff is no longer visible, no longer visible. And so spectral imaging comes along, which can filter out that newsprint and can see the faded ink from the berries and the impressions of his writing instruments and give us a perfect journal that David Livingstone wrote over a century ago that was no longer visible. So yes, it has been applied to all kinds of things and is used extensively in space technology. But as far as I know, the reflectance transformation imaging has not been used.
When you wrote your request for funding for spectral imaging, how much were you requesting?
You know, what we asked for is the work to be done. And we didn't provide a budget because what they had done in the past is they just said, sure, if you can justify it's being done, we'll do it. And we didn't ask questions about money, and they didn't either. And so I don't know. The RTI is very inexpensive. The entire equipment doesn't cost about $10,000. I mean, that may seem like a lot to you. In the bigger scheme of things, that's not very much. But the multispectral imaging been set up to do it a few $1,000s, but more than they were willing to spend. The thing that changed their mind and enabled them to do it is a long and circuitous story, which I can't take any credit for, that happened actually behind the scenes. Just out of the blue, they came through and did it for us, and I'm thankful for that. But I don't know the cost, but it's expensive. This whole business is expensive. I've never been told what they paid for this manuscript when they bought it from the Sporting Collection in Oslo. I could find out a little bit for sure. So they bought it from Christie's is the famous auction house, and then they bought it through them, so it could be traced. It's in the public domain. I don't know how much they paid for it. Somebody asked me one time, somebody who's working within the Green Organization asked me one time how much they insured me for to look at the manuscript. And I didn't know that. They insured me for $1 million just to look at it. And he said, I don't know what that says about what they paid for the manuscript. He said, I know that means they paid probably $500,000. I mean, that was his guess. But, so I'm insured for $1 million, again, just to hold the thing in my hand. Even then, I have somebody watching all the time. And I love it. I mean, it's precious material. We're probably out of time. I'd be glad to talk to others who want to hang around and have some more time and take a look at something, but we've probably already gone over our time limit a little bit.
Thank you very much. So, truly two fascinating lectures. This one, both of them were really fantastic. This one was extremely fascinating. Thank you very much for being with us, coming all the way from California and spending the day with us. Appreciate that very much. We appreciate your presence here and your interest in these matters, your interest in New Testament scholarship, biblical scholarship generally. I should mention that the next time something like this will happen is, I think, in April, and Luke Timothy Johnson, right, will be here in April. That's in the library. I don't know when in April, but sometime in April.